Hello. Thank you for coming. Can everybody hear in the back? Good. My name is Alex Rosenblat, and I'm the author of Uberland, How Algorithms Are Rewriting the Rules of Work. I really hate PowerPoint slides, but there's images in the book, I promise, that will help to illustrate some of my talk today. I'm also a researcher at the Data and Society Research Institute, which is based in New York City. I'm going to give you this speech in two parts. One part is a speech I was planning to give you, and then I changed my mind. So I will also give you part two. They require two different lines of thought, but I want you to think about both of them. First, I'm going to talk about a cool taxi service, but then I'm going to talk about technology and shifting powers of governance in the United States. Between 2014 and 2018, I conducted qualitative research with hundreds of Uber drivers across more than 25 cities in the United States and Canada, and across online forums with memberships of about 300,000 drivers collectively. Although this workforce is disaggregated, and they have no formal way to speak with one another through Uber, they've forged a workplace culture online, in Facebook groups, on WhatsApp, on dedicated message boards, and driver websites. Every day for about 4 years, I would sit there in their forums, reading their posts, their screenshots. In a digitally mediated workplace, there's so much evidence that can be collected and shared about the changing circumstances of your working conditions. Algorithms are a really important part of Uber's employment model. Algorithms are simply rules that are enacted by code. The surge pricing algorithm is probably the most familiar one. When passenger demand for rides outstrips the local supply of drivers, Uber's surge pricing algorithm goes into effect, multiplying the price. Some drivers describe this as a herding tool because they get notices and maps that light up inside of their apps saying, go to where there is high demand, in the hopes that you'll receive a higher pay premium for your work, although there is no guarantee. One driver, after spending 20 minutes relocating to a surge pricing zone, received a request from the dispatcher for a trip outside of the surge zone, so there was no premium. He canceled it, and the next day he received an email from Uber threatening to deactivate him, a technology word for suspend or fire him, because he was accused of surge manipulation. That's important because drivers are billed by Uber as entrepreneurs who can be their own boss. Someone who can make an informed decision about the type of work they are willing to do might be able to reject a trip that doesn't come with a pay premium, especially after their algorithmic manager suggested they should relocate for just such purpose. But the lines of control are quite blurry in a system of algorithmic management. Travis Kalanick, Uber's former and probably more infamous CEO, described the surge pricing algorithm like this. Uber is not setting the price. The market is setting the price. We have algorithms to determine what the market is. The implication is strong. Uber has the technology to reflect the dynamics of the marketplace. The technology itself is neutral, the connective tissue that matches a passenger with a driver. And that's very important because when Uber identifies as a technology platform, it's suggesting that it's simply a neutral intermediary, like a credit card, that simply facilitates interactions. What I found in my years of research is that Uber has the ability to manipulate the conditions of work and the conditions under which passengers accept rides as well. For example, computer scientists at Northeastern University, Li Chen, Alan Mislov, and Christo Wilson found that passengers standing in the same surge pricing zone might receive different surge multipliers. Your fare will cost 3 times as much as the market rates. I'm standing right next to you, and somehow mine is going to cost only 2.6 times. the market rates. Uber describes this finding as a bug, but I would suggest that it's part of a larger structure under which people can be targeted for different prices and different wages. The dynamics of price discrimination are quite familiar across lots of different practices, but they're contradicted by the idea that technology is offering a neutral service. The tension here is trading on assumptions about tech as neutral to quietly manipulate prices and wages. Of course, the exculpatory language of technology is fascinating. When Uber charges passengers what it predicts they are willing to pay based on their route, rather than by standard market rates, economists may call it price discrimination, but Uber explains it as an innovation in artificial intelligence. And so again and again, we return to the language of technology as asking us not to believe what we see, but to see something different there. Uber promotes drivers as entrepreneurs who can be their own boss. But in my research, I found that they do have a boss, an algorithmic one, that enacts the rules Uber sets for how drivers should behave on the job. Drivers don't have a human supervisor, nor do they have an employment handbook. And this is quite common across the gig economy sector because there's an intense debate over misclassification, whether workers in the gig economy who find jobs through an app are properly classified as independent contractors rather than as employees who might be entitled to workplace protections. So no one gets told, here's how you should do your job from day one. There's no employee handbook. Instead, they get messages, as drivers do, such as, passengers give the best ratings, or 5-star drivers behave in the following listicle of ways. And from that, from notices about how drivers are suggested they behave in order to earn high ratings, that's a lot of how Uber might communicate how exactly you should behave on the job. Of course, you don't have to behave in the ways that Uber suggests, but the rating system is actually a management enforcement tool. If your rating drops below the threshold that Uber sets, let's say 4.6 out of 5 stars, then you risk being deactivated, suspended, or fired. For drivers, this was a long-standing source of frustration because it was unclear to many passengers what the rating system stood for. If you've ever taken an Uber, a Lyft, or something like it, you'll notice at the end of a trip, you're prompted to rate your experience on a scale of 1 to 5 stars. For a lot of people, they get from A to B, all their limbs are still attached. They might say, okay, this is 4 out of 5 stars. This wasn't the most mind-blowing trip I've ever had, but I got the job done. And for drivers, a 4 out of 5 might be a failing grade. So they'd go home and be animated by anxiety over which passenger gave them the bad rating or an unfair rating, perhaps, for circumstances beyond their control, such as when there was bad weather or surge pricing was in effect. There's also the quite interesting phenomenon that although drivers are narrated as entrepreneurs who run small businesses, Uber might suggest to them, riders count on Uber for a comfortable and relaxing experience. They prefer for drivers not to promote other businesses during the trip. Since drivers actually earn referral bonuses through affiliate codes from referring passengers to new services they haven't tried yet, like Lyft, or like DoorDash, or Postmates, or Juno, and the variety of local offerings in different cities across and beyond the United States and Canada, stopping yourself from suggesting another business or promoting another one will directly hinder your own business interests as a driver. You won't earn that referral bonus. Although Uber has made some improvements to the rating system in the last year or so, they might now receive ratings protection so that the rating that they receive for circumstances beyond their control, like weather, no longer affects their average. But that took many, many years to get to and wasn't a feature of their workplace during the times that I was observing drivers. And the funny thing is, although you can introduce new features that might improve the driver experience, there's absolutely no guarantee that those features will still be in place 6 months later. Drivers might get a pay increase, and then half a year later, the rates at which they earn per mile and per minute are cut. If you have a contract, your employer can't simply experiment with the different features at all times. Especially not if you have a contract as an employee or if you're part of a collective bargaining agreement, you sort of agree on what the terms are going to be. In a workforce where drivers really have very few employment protections because they're independent contractors, and in an environment that's mediated by a technology app, you can constantly experiment with the conditions of that workplace. I think that's actually complicated some of the media coverage of these companies as well, because they might generate positive credit for introducing a new feature, but that feature might be taken away later, leading to, for example, driver protests. For a lot of reasons, having an algorithmically managed workplace is actually quite efficient and practical. Setting a route with a GPS mapping algorithm saves the driver a lot of trouble, because they don't really have to know where they're going to start doing this work, although it helps. But there are policy consequences for not following the recommended route that is generated by the GPS mapping algorithms. If you deviate from the route that's recommended and the passenger makes a complaint, you might notice that as a driver, there's some missing pay from your pay stub. You won't even be directly alerted that your pay is being changed. You have to catch it and then try an email with remote customer service agents who might be located in the Philippines over your missing pay. And what you can expect is an exchange of 3 to 6 emails going back and forth with template automated responses. So much so that drivers started to call these customer service agents Uber's robots. One driver was a bit savvier, and he, along with what many others have started to do, had a dash cam at the time when one drunken passenger was saying, "No, turn left here and turn right here and forget what the map says, and just I know where I'm going." And the next day, the passenger woke up, emailed Uber and said, "Oh, this rider took me on a ride. They didn't follow the correct route." And Uber said, "You're right." And so they retracted the wages. But this driver had this dash cam footage, which he'd adopted because drivers largely perceive that Uber favors the passenger in disputes, and because Uber doesn't monitor the qualitative experience as well as it can monitor the quantitative experience of, "You took this route," or "the map said this." And so he was able to get his money back. But for a lot of drivers, it's a daunting task, and you may not benefit in the end from spending an hour writing back and forth with unfeeling customer service agents when you could simply do another trip. It's a feature of this workplace that may scaffold, potentially, wide-scale, low-level wage theft. Even though drivers are supposed to be their own boss, Uber may reduce the control drivers have in how they respond to algorithmic dispatches. In other words, they can't just choose the jobs that work for them. For example, in many cities, and for a long time, Uber automatically dispatched Uber pool trips, the carpool service, to drivers who really only wanted to work for UberX. And they would do the same for drivers who had specifically made the capital investment of purchasing an SUV to drive for a higher tier of service so that they could earn higher rates. Instead, they might get dispatches for UberX, at which you'd earn significantly lower rates for operating a Prius as opposed to an SUV. Drivers had quite mixed success trying to opt out. They'd email with Uber and say, "I don't want to be given these dispatches." And sometimes Uber would say, "OK," and other times they would not. They would continue to dispatch more unfavorable trips. A lot of drivers actually quite dislike the Uber pool option because it's a lot more work. You have to manage the different passengers in your car. One of them likes this music, one of them, likes this other one, and they have a conflict, and in the end, they give you a bad rating, which to drivers is very frustrating. And you don't earn especially more for driving a trip with multiple passengers as opposed to just taking a request from one. These sound like small items, but they all build up to a larger case about the kinds of employment control Uber can leverage over how drivers behave at work. And they, in many ways, contradict the idea that drivers are operating their own small businesses. In a lot of ways, despite marginal improvements to the features of driver work, drivers don't have the information or power to make informed decisions. In the most basic example, Uber hides the passenger destination from drivers before they arrive to pick you up. Let's say they have to drive for 20 minutes after they accept the dispatch, and you only want to go 2 blocks. The driver's losing money on that trip. And of course, the driver can technically cancel the trip if they prefer, but they risk being deactivated by Uber if their trip rejection rate is too high. And so they never really have all the information they need. They can sort of try and make decisions in the margins of their experience. Interestingly, the policy of blind passenger acceptance was touted early on by Uber as something that could resolve a long-standing issue of discrimination. For people of color, and especially for black men in the United States, it's really hard to hail a cab at the side of the road. They might pass you by and go to the nearest white passenger. And so Uber's technology was promising, as Silicon Valley often does, to resolve a long-standing social issue of discrimination. And what I found in my years of research with drivers is that it was part of a larger policy of algorithmic management. When Cecily McCall, an Uber driver in Florida, was driving one day, she had a passenger who called her the N-word. She stopped the trip early, and Uber retracted some of her wages. She wrote in to explain what had happened, and she received a form letter back. It said, oh, we're so sorry this happened to you, but we will make sure not to match this passenger with you again. She was disgusted because this meant that the passenger could continue to ride with other drivers who were then vulnerable to harassment, to deactivation, and to other consequences. It was a good reminder that there's a subtle implication to a workplace where so much is automated, where so much communication is principally robotic. Uber could have communicated that her reporting was valuable, that she was there to protect her fellow drivers. It could have built a core sense of participation from a very disaggregated driver workforce, that you're there to protect each other and that your employer has your back. Interestingly, the types of communication that take place, the quality of them being so robotic, just lots of emails and texts, having no human resource that you can check in with, it leaves drivers vulnerable to phishing attacks. Texts and in-app notifications, they say they're coming from Uber, maybe they're coming from somebody else. Scholars Elizabeth Watkins and Kendra Albert have highlighted this in particular. And I also remember an early post a driver made to one of those Facebook groups, these online forums I referred to earlier. Someone had phoned him to get his banking information. Oh, hi, I'm Uber. There's a problem with your payment going into your account. We want to make sure you get paid. Could you please give us the correct digits? And when the driver posted this incident to a forum, the drivers were laughing. They were like, you should have known. Uber would never phone you. And so there's these interesting ways in which new efficiencies that are ushered in by technology also experience soft losses of social trust and how you find and reassure workers and employers about how their bond will be secured. There's also, of course, material benefits to automating workflows. An algorithmic management system dispatches drivers' jobs largely based on the nearest driver gets the ride. And for a lot of drivers who had previous occupational identities as drivers, like former taxi drivers, truckers, this was great because it seemed more fair. In traditional practice, you might have to tip the dispatcher to get more favorable rides. So this seemed like a really great option. My colleagues and I at Data and Society started to compare the Uber model, which has often been the symbol for the gig economy and disruption from Silicon Valley, with some of the other marketplaces that exist for employment. And in particular, my very astute colleagues noted that women were a big missing piece of the gig economy conversations. Professor Julia Ticona and Alexandra Matescu examined how platforms affect care and cleaning workers, and we compared it to ride-hail drivers and what I was seeing as well. Sites like care.com, which have over 10 million active profiles compared to the 900,000 active Uber drivers that are at work each year, are quite a significant part of the gig economy, but they're often understated in media coverage. We found a very important distinction between these two workplaces. Care.com workers would have to message back and forth with potential families, employers, a whole bunch of times, like online dating, just to try and get the job. But with Uber, you had an algorithmic dispatcher that just got you the job, even if the details could be a bit insidious and a bit unfair. A lot of drivers will say they prefer the feeling of independence that comes with an algorithmic boss compared to a human manager who might be looking over your shoulder. But when something goes wrong, they find they have very little recourse, very little source of redress. A faceless boss can also monitor you in much more granular ways. Uber monitors when drivers brake too harshly or accelerate too quickly, or when a passenger claims that they are drunk. It might not be uncommon that a passenger who gets in the car at the end of the bar shift might have the odor of alcohol or drugs, and the driver takes them to their destination. But then the next passenger gets in the car and says, "Oh, I detect something smells off in here." And they report the driver for driving under the influence. Suddenly, the driver's lost his job. He's on the side of the road, emailing back and forth with remote customer service agents in the Philippines and trying to get reinstated and explain, "Hi, my name is Ramon. I have diabetes. If I've been drinking the way that the passenger said, I'd be in the hospital. Please help me resolve this issue." A lot of what I've described today is quite a lot about control and how you leverage it, even if it's under the auspices of technology. But Silicon Valley algorithms have a mythical reputation as neutral, objective, and even benevolent tools, and that myth reduces the appearance of control. For example, the Facebook newsfeed is curated by algorithms, and there's no visible editor manipulating what news you see. Similarly, Uber tried to replicate that relationship in the workplace. Work is managed and curated by algorithms, and there's no visible manager. But the company establishes the rates at which drivers earn their small business income and changes those rates perennially. It monitors their behavior, and it disciplines them with threats of deactivation. Uber also brings the culture of experimentation that Silicon Valley is so celebrated for to the workplace. For example, starting in 2016, Uber quietly implemented a practice called Upfront Pricing, which supposedly fostered greater transparency. Passengers could now see in advance what a fare would cost based on Uber's best guess or estimate of the trip tally, rather than waiting for the tally at the end of the trip. The problem was that not everything was so upfront. Months before Uber finally admitted that it was charging passengers sometimes a higher fare than the driver was earning, drivers started to notice discrepancies. They might ask a passenger, "Can I see what you paid?" at the end of a trip, because it didn't match the fare they expected. You see, drivers had a contract and an understanding with Uber that they would remit back to Uber, let's say 25% of what the passenger paid, plus Uber's fee, so it's usually like 30%. And suddenly, a driver notices the passenger paid $90 and the driver earned $30. In some cases, actually, the passenger paid less than the driver was earning. But the problem is that this all happened very opaquely. Drivers crowdsourced receipts and comparisons in online forums across the country to identify that Uber had implemented a new pricing policy that in some ways contradicted what they expected from their contracts. And I think to some extent, this was just another sort of feature of experimentation that Silicon Valley is so famous for. Facebook similarly conducted an emotional contagion experiment on unsuspecting users a couple of years ago. Some users were displayed sadder posts, and others were displayed happier posts to see if the effect of that emotion would spread. And when Facebook published the results of that study showing the effects of emotional contagion, people were really mad. They were mad because they were guinea pigs in an experiment on their emotional health that they did not sign up for. And I think they were a bit mad because it contradicted the idea that the algorithms that curate so much of our lives are not, in fact, these neutral, facilitative objects, that they can, in fact, manipulate us even when we're unsuspecting. Now I'm going to switch gears a little bit. As some of you may have heard, Uber is going to become a publicly traded company on May 10th. And that's repositioning Uber at the center of debates over the impact of technology on society. What I've noticed in my years as a Canadian in the US, actually, is that Silicon Valley is almost a part of American nationalism. When technology companies make exaggerated claims about how their technology changes the world, those claims are circulated as credible because there is such a strong belief in Silicon Valley as a fountain of genius and progress and economic productivity. For example, Uber rose to power in the aftermath of the Great Recession, and it promised to scale entrepreneurship for the masses. That was a very appealing claim. It drew on Americans' valorization of entrepreneurship, that you should become a self-made person, and the timing was right. Cities were covered in blight, people lost their jobs, their businesses, and here was this app offering not only a low barrier to access job, anyone could sign up and be at work in under a week even. They were also offering a pathway to the middle class in a country shaken by economic insecurity and employment precarity. They made claims like, come work for us. The median driver earnings in New York City are upwards of $90,000 a year. It was a very appealing claim. Unfortunately, it was not true. The Federal Trade Commission investigated how Uber recruited drivers with exaggerated earnings claims and found that they had been deceiving drivers with deceptive advertisements. They sued, and Uber later settled for $20 million. But the important thing is that the claim was broadly circulated. Drivers can start working for an app, be entrepreneurs, and earn $90,000 a year. It was foundational to creating an environment of regulatory forbearance. It's where the laws exist, but regulators choose not to enforce them because they don't want to stem the benefits and the promise of innovation. And so these foundational myths about what technology can do a lot to create regulatory arbitrage for companies, particularly in the United States. I think outside of the United States, Uber has faced a lot more backlash over more promising claims about how its technology is different from what it appears to be. It wasn't until last year that economist Lawrence Mitchell sort of looked at all the different earnings claims around drivers and their expenses and found that drivers were actually earning, on average, about a take-home pay of $10.87 American per hour after deducting Uber fees, vehicle expenses, and the mandatory Social Security and Medicare taxes that self-employed drivers must pay. It's not that the US is uniquely vulnerable to a type of nationalistic belief in a natural resource. If a company in Canada, where I'm from, so I'm going to take some license here, made claims that they could offer jobs in the oil fields that paid tremendous amounts and that also would be a salve to social discrimination and would make Canada's name on the world stage, I think that some of those claims might be credibly circulated. Every country has foundational myths that people buy into and that give promise and hope to what can be offered. In the United States, technology nationalism is inextricably linked to changing structures of collective governance. On May 10th, Uber will debut on the stock exchange and valued at upwards of $91 billion. The company is asking the public and lay investors to set aside the fact that it is an unprofitable ride-hailing company that lost $1.8 billion last year. Instead, it asks us to believe that it is the future of transportation. This is the same company that, along with Lyft, its major competitor in the US, insists that it's not in the transportation business because it's a technology company. The EU ruled differently on that, where Uber was considered a taxi company. But in the United States, both companies continue to argue that they are not obliged to provide accessible services to passengers with disabilities under the Americans with Disabilities Act, unlike their competitors in the transportation business. That says a lot, I think, about Uber's ambition to be the future of transportation. It's the kind where the company can issue responsibilities to civil society. Technology isn't just disrupting how we work or how we get around. It's distorting reality and reshaping narratives. What I've seen through my research is how much technology disrupts a shared set of facts and understanding. Uber looks like a taxi company, but it sidesteps regulations designed for transportation companies by self-identifying as a technology company. While Uber promotes drivers as entrepreneurs and classifies them as independent contractors, I found that drivers do have a boss, an algorithmic one. The control that emanates from a faceless boss is often hard to pin down, but the effects are evident. For Uber's drivers, technology is being used to exclude workers from the benefits they would be entitled to as employees, like a minimum wage. Some Uber drivers in major ride-hailing markets, including Los Angeles and New York, are planning to go on strike in advance of Uber's IPO, drawing attention to pay cuts and unfair working conditions. But Uber leverages technology to change how we understand their work in the first place. Algorithmic management isn't necessarily that different from management, because Uber leverages significant control over how drivers work. It sets the rates, for example. It doesn't give them the information they need. That issue of control is at the center of disputes over whether drivers should be classified as independent contractors or as employees. And across the world, beyond the United States, this has been a site of dispute with different resolutions. When drivers from Massachusetts and California sued Uber in a class action lawsuit alleging they were misclassified as independent contractors, Uber's lawyers argued in open court that drivers are actually customers of Uber's technology, just like passengers. That sounds like wordplay, but it's changing the paradigm. Uber drivers may have to seek redress for unfair working conditions or wage theft, for example, not under labor law, but under consumer protection laws that prohibit unfair and deceptive practices. It's important to keep in mind that Uber drivers only account for 0.56% of, less than 1% of the labor force in the United States. But Uber's cultural impact is far greater because it is introducing these fundamental paradigm shifts about what it means to work or to consume technology. Uber constantly advances the culture of technology to suggest that it isn't what it looks like. And that cultural work is largely successful in the United States, with direct implications for its business model. For example, Uber is either misclassifying millions of drivers as independent contractors, or it is coordinating prices for millions of small independent firms, which may violate antitrust laws against anti-competitive behavior. Uber is unique in that it exists with so many multiple conflicting truths, but that doesn't cut both ways. For example, the city of Seattle tried to extend collective bargaining rights to drivers, but the Federal Trade Commission and the US Chamber of Commerce sided with Uber to successfully oppose the mainstay of the city's efforts. Independent contractors can't bargain collectively over pay because it's inconsistent with antitrust laws and labor laws. It's anti-competitive for a group of small independent firms to come together and decide on the price they're going to charge to consumers. And yet, that's precisely what Uber is able to do through algorithmic price fixing, like the surge pricing algorithm. Uber's technology ideology comes from Silicon Valley, and how that becomes entrenched in law and practice is a microcosm for a larger political battle over power and governance. Technology has changed how people access information, as Dr. Dana Boyd argues. Tech platforms, from YouTube, which is owned by Google, to Facebook, are structured to personalize our experiences as search engines and recommendation systems. These structures are raising new questions about how we arrive at a common set of facts in a networked media environment, especially because the vulnerabilities in that information architecture can be manipulated to shape public knowledge. However, at a time when there is simply more political uncertainty about governance in the United States, platforms are increasingly recognized as proxies for political power. We appeal to Facebook, to Twitter, or to Google to regulate discriminatory bias or speech. On a national scale, what we're seeing is a cultural transference. American culture is antagonistic to even the perception of government overreach. Now Facebook is constantly in the news, dwarfing coverage of actual countries. The company stands accused of overreach, for privacy violations and for threatening democracy. It's the same American grudge, but redirected at an entirely different governing structure, tech platforms. And it suggests that we are looking towards tech companies to usher in new forms of governance. Elected politicians sense that something is amiss, even if they don't know exactly what to name the source or the effect. Some are striking back. Republican Senator Ted Cruz and Democratic Speaker of the House, Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi, and presidential candidate Senator Elizabeth Warren are acknowledging that tech companies have amassed too much concentrated power. Some, like Senator Warren, frame it as a monopoly issue and propose to break up big tech. Others, like Senator Cruz, frame it as an issue of free speech, alleging that tech companies have an anti-conservative bias in how they curate our media and information spheres. Silicon Valley companies expanded in a largely unregulated environment. No one wanted to hinder innovation. Political leaders, as well as scholars and advocates, proposed to reduce their power by regulating them. The growing political will to regulate Silicon Valley is evident, and that may be a direct risk to the business models of companies like Uber, Facebook, and others. But technology also changes how we understand what we know or how we arrive at a common set of facts. From my own research, I've seen that regulatory interventions into Uber's model are not coordinated or necessarily aligned. As regulators grapple with what it means to be employed by an app like Uber, their conclusions are often at cross purposes for resolving their employment relationship between Uber and its drivers, and for gig economy workers broadly. For example, while the New York State Unemployment Insurance Appeal Board ruled that drivers are employees for the purpose of receiving unemployment benefits, multiple states, like Texas and Alaska, have passed laws codifying Uber driver status as independent contractors. However, as law scholar Charlotte Garden has observed, how states define Uber drivers has no legal effect on determinations under the federal Fair Labor Standards Act or the National Labor Relations Act. And of course, one consequence of a patchwork approach to regulating or challenging a company like Uber is that the company might sail through variable interventions into its labor practices. The challenges professional drivers face to earn a reliable wage are real. And even if Uber is replaced by a competitor tomorrow, the legal battles over what kind of a company it is and whether its practices are lawful will have long-lasting effects on how people are employed. And in the end, that's a larger metaphor for what gets underwritten by the power of a faceless boss. Technology is raising questions about who holds the power of governance, whether it's over the rules of work or the regulation of speech. And the questions suggest that the ground has already shifted beneath our feet through epistemological fracturing, and that we're looking towards new forms of collective governance driven by platforms. Thank you very much for listening. I will not be hosting a public question and answer period from the stage because I find it a bit impersonal, but I will happily wait by the side of the stage for anyone who wants to have a short discussion. Thank you.
We